So this is Chapter 11, Section 4, Social Influence, Intro to Conformity and Obedience. And this presentation is by Grace Boynton and Taylor Breidenthal. So the textbook definition of conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard. And in our own words, it is complying to a widely held belief, practice, or way of thinking. The textbook definition of obedience is how a person responds to outright commands and following orders. In our own words, it is a submissive response to a command given by someone with status. So, in regards to conformity, there is something called the chameleon effect, which is the non-conscious mimicry of postures, facial expressions, or behavior to match that of others in the current environment. So, for example, yawning, crossing your legs, and hand movements are all subconscious things that we do and mimic people that we may not even realize. This effect actually helps to create empathy, and it helps to explain why we feel happier when around a happy person or sad around someone who is negative or sad all the time. And more mimicry creates greater empathy. We are more likely to conform when we feel incompetent or insecure, are in a group of 3 or more people, are in a group in which everyone else agrees with one side of something, or where we admire a group status, have not committed to a response, where we know we are being observed, or where we're from a culture that respects social standards. So there's something called the normative social influence, which is conforming to a group to avoid rejection or gain social approval. And informal social influence is conforming to become accurate. So in the image below, there was a study done where when someone was presented with 4 lines and asked to identify which line on the right side of things matched the line on the left side of things, participants chose the correct one. But when put in a group where the other participants agree on the wrong answer, the original person will conform to the group and agree, knowing that it was the wrong choice. So obedience is most likely when someone is giving orders, is close at hand, and seems legit. They seem qualified, they know what they're talking about. And there are no role models for defiance. If a victim is depersonalized or not in the vicinity, we're more likely to be obedient. And if an authority figure is supported by a well-known institution, for example, Yale, Harvard, they have a high up education, then we're more likely to be obedient to them. So in a famous experiment done by a man named Stanley Milgram, who was a professor at Yale, Milgram wanted to see if participants would administer painful shocks to others because they were instructed to do so by an authority figure. At the end of the study, he found 60% of participants followed orders all the way up until the last shock, which these shocks were getting increasingly painful for the victim. And even when Milgram ran a new study where the fake test subject complained of a slight heart condition, 65% of participants still delivered every shock. So what do the social influence studies teach us about ourselves? Milgram essentially forced a choice. Do I remain true to my own standards and morality, even when they conflict with expectations? Participants were conflicted, but obedience ultimately proved stronger than kindness. And strong social influences can make people conform to falsehoods or give in to cruel acts. So Milgram used the foot in the door technique, which is where you justify a small action which makes the next action tolerable. And a good example of this was the Nazi soldiers used German civil servants in World War II to do Holocaust paperwork rather than to do the actual killing or extermination of Jewish people. How much power do we have as individuals? Researchers found that influential people held firmly to their beliefs. The power of social influence is enormous, but so are the powers of the committed individual. Social control references the power of the situation, and personal control references the power of the individual, and these two concepts interact. Minority influence is the power of 1 or 2 individuals to sway majority. Great examples of this would be Gandhi, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhi held firmly to his beliefs and was influencing millions of people. Rosa Parks went against the tide and sat at the front of the bus, which initially started the civil rights movement. And this was unheard of for a woman of color to do this at this time. And so she went against the majority and ended up swaying them. Martin Luther King Jr., with his talks of peaceful protest rather than being violent to get where they wanted, was what drove the civil rights movement forward. So, lastly, we did find an article from APA.org, and it's actually very interesting. New research replicated Milgram's findings on obedience. So, Milgram was a professor at Yale, and he did his first experiment in 1961. So, this was a long time ago. So, there's a lot of people who have said, times have changed, and um, they wouldn't get the same result. Like, people wouldn't give a shock, like, that's too cruel. But a social psychologist, Jerry M. Berger, he actually found people are still just as willing to administer what they believe are painful electric shocks to others when urged on by an authority figure. So Berger found no difference in the rates of obedience, and he basically generated the exact same results. So he actually also implicated safeguards that made sure none of the participants had any knowledge of Milgram's studies, such as if they'd taken a psychology course, he wouldn't let them participate in the study because they may have heard of obedience and conformity, or maybe they heard of Milgram's famous study. So this is actually a really interesting article, and I definitely recommend checking it out. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for watching.